Aloha students, and welcome to the lecture on Chapter 4. In Chapter 4, we're going to be talking about a couple of topics. The first is quality control, quality management, and the second is activity-based costing. For the area of quality and quality management, I just want to focus on terminology and broad concepts, so we'll kind of quickly go through the slides related to quality. Most of it is pretty self-explanatory, so I don't think I need to spend a lot of time on it. And again, as I said, the main thing I want to get out of this is terminology. So there's four kinds of costs of quality. So in order to achieve good quality, there are four different kinds of costs. There are four different concepts related to cost of quality. First is prevention costs. Prevention costs are things that a company does ahead of time before they start making a product in order to assure quality products. So these are things done up front. So things like inspecting the materials before they're put into production process, looking carefully at the production process itself, inspecting the equipment, and then having good employee training. So again, prevention costs are things you do, the cost of the things that help ensure quality that are done beforehand. Appraisal costs, on the other hand, are done after the fact. So after the product is made. That includes things like inspections of the finished goods and then testing the products out in the field. Okay, so again, appraisal costs are costs that are incurred after the product is already done to ensure quality products. Two other concepts related to quality. Internal failure costs are cost to discover defects before they're delivered to the customer. So after they're done, after the appraisal process, then there's things or costs that occur. Again, before you deliver the goods to customers, you do things like reworking. If you have to rework any products because they're defective, you might have to scrap the materials if you've inspected the materials and found they're not good. The cost of re-inspecting again after you've reworked it. So these are costs. Internal failure costs are costs that occur before you send the product to the customer. External failure costs are costs that are discovered after you've sent the product along to the customer. These are things like warranties, product liability. So if somebody sues you over your product, okay, the product image. So you might have to spend money to improve your product image if you have delivered bad products to the customer. And then lost sales due to bad reputation, that kind of thing. Okay, so again, the main thing here is just to know the terminology. You can read this yourself. I guess one of the key things here is you have to balance the cost of preventing defects versus the failure costs. So you can make your process fail-proof, but then it'll cost you a lot of money to do that. So there's a balancing act. Yeah. TQM, you may have heard this term in management or leadership classes. I'll leave it for those kinds of classes. But TQM, the focus is managing an organization so that it excels in areas important to the customer. So customer focus and achieving quality as defined by the customer. Again, this slide simply says that there's a cost to having quality assurance programs, and is the cost worth the benefits you get out of it? That's one view. Another view is for the long term, Customer satisfaction is more important than the cost of improving quality. So it's worth it to put money into quality, improving quality as much as you can, because quality is free. Not really, quality is not free, but in the long term, the cost of quality is not all that great compared to customer satisfaction. So those are two opposing views, sort of the cost of achieving quality. Don't worry so much about this. These are ways to identify problems, charts, bar graphs, those kinds of things. Again, this is more suited for another type of class other than an accounting class. So here's some examples of those different kinds of things. Okay, as I said, most of this is self-explanatory. The concept of benchmarking we'll see several times throughout this course, but basically that means comparing your organization through various measures against other organizations or against industry averages. In order for things to be meaningful, they have to be compared to something. That's what benchmarking is all about. Okay, the concept of just-in-time inventory is both getting materials, preparing or producing products, shipping them to customers, all are done right before they're needed. Yeah, so for example, materials. In just-in-time, you don't have a lot of materials on hand, so there's no warehouse full of materials. You get the materials when you need them for production. Yeah, making parts, you only make the parts just before assembling them into final products, so you don't make parts ahead of time. And again, these are all this just-in-time is based on the theory that it's best not to do things too early, because then you have to store materials or parts or the completed product. So, and it costs money to store, warehouse space, shipping costs, or transporting costs from the warehouse, et cetera, et cetera. So just-in-time inventory assumes that it's best to get materials, make parts, finish the product right before you need to. Okay, that's the whole concept behind just-in-time inventory. You can see here benefits of just-in-time. TQM again is total quality control. Yeah, so here's some of the benefits: no warehouse space, reducing your inventory carrying costs. You don't need warehouse people, for example. Yeah. You don't have to worry about spoilage or obsolete inventory because you're not making it ahead of time. You're doing it right before you need it. So that's some of the benefits of just-in-time. They don't really tell you the downside, but sometimes it's difficult to get materials, for example, when you need it. Okay, your supplier of the materials might be backed up, so you're not able to get it. And if you wanted to produce tomorrow and you're going to order the materials today for delivery tomorrow, what if the supplier isn't able to do that? Then you're all messed up because you wouldn't be able to produce because you don't have the materials. So that's the downside of just-in-time, is you're relying on suppliers to supply you exactly when you need it, which is sometimes a risk. Okay, don't worry about these just-in-time accounting inventories. Okay, those will be, it's beyond the scope of this course. Okay, so another topic in this chapter, and the more important topic in my mind, is activity-based costing. Remember, costing, we want to try to figure out how much products cost, and we need to know how much products cost in order to know how much to sell them for. So in an earlier chapter, we looked at job costing, where we kept track of costs by jobs or projects or products. So some kind of discrete, separate thing. In activity-based costing, we're going to be keeping track of costs by processes, steps in the process, or activities. So here's the major steps in activity-based costing. And these symbols, kind of keep these in mind, because for the rest of the slides, the authors use this symbol to help you remember the different steps. So the first step in activity-based costing is to identify the activities. So again, these might be steps in the process, and you're keeping track of cost for steps that you're doing to make your product. Example of that might be making spam musubi. You want to know how much it costs you to make a single spam musubi. So if you use activity-based costing, you figure out the cost of each different step in the process of making spam musubi. Those are the activities. So the activities may be buying the spam, so having somebody go out and shop and buy the materials or the ingredients needed. That might be an activity. Another activity might be cooking and slicing spam. Another activity might be cooking rice. Third activity might be putting together the rice and the spam. So those are steps in the process, and we're keeping track of our costs for each of those steps. We're going to eventually put all those steps together to get the cost of a single spam musubi. Okay, so anyway, first identify the activities. Next is to identify the cost driver for each activity. So in order to spread out the cost, what is a logical way to spread it out? A labor-intensive process, for example, the cutting of the spam. If that's a labor-intensive activity, then it makes sense to keep track of the cost for that process or activity by hours, man hours. How much time did it take us to cut X number of spam into slices? So cost drivers are what is the way that we're spreading out the cost over the activity. Yeah, so what are we using to spread out the cost? That's a cost driver. Next step then is to compute a cost per unit for that driver. So in the case of a spam musubi, it's how much does it cost us to slice a single spam musubi. So for the driver, it'd be how much does it cost us per hour to cut spam musubi? And then final major step is then to take that rate that we computed for that particular driver, multiply by the number of driver units used. So if we figured out, for example, that it cost us, 30 cents per hour to cut spam musubi, we multiply that by the number of hours. So if it took 100 hours let's say 1,000 hours in a month for cutting spam musubi, we multiply those 1,000 hours times the 30 cents per hour, and we'll get $300. That's what it cost us to do that activity. Again, the activity in this case would be slicing the spam musubi. Okay, so again, for each activity, we figure out how much it cost us for that particular activity. And these are the steps that we use. And we'll go through an example of this in a second. So the appropriate cost driver to use as the way to spread out the total cost to these subsections or into the units of driver It should be something that makes sense or is related to what the process is. If it's a machine intensive step in the process, we might use machine hours or number of setting up the machines. Machine setups are when you change the configuration or what the machine does in order to accommodate the production step that you're going to do. So you have to change the settings and that kind of stuff. That's a machine setup. Okay, so these are logical cost drivers to spread out the total cost for a machine intensive process. As we said earlier, labor hours might be a logical cost driver to use for a labor intensive activity. Okay. Okay, so the factors in choosing a cost driver, okay, are causal relationship. In other words, they're significantly related. So using machines and machine hours, those are significantly related. That's the causal relationship. Yeah. So anyway, the driver that you use for each activity has to make sense for that activity. And that's basically what this thing here is saying. Okay. So cost per cost driver unit. So it's a predetermined cost rate. So for a period of time, you have to estimate the cost for that activity, the indirect costs. So these are overhead costs for that activity, because remember, direct labor is easy to measure. You can figure out the hours that a person is putting into an activity, because all that person's time goes directly to the activity. So that's a direct cost. That's easy to measure. Direct materials. So the materials that go into a process, that's easy to track because you know what the materials are that go into a process. However, indirect or overhead costs need to be allocated to the activity. So here's the steps involved in figuring out how much to charge the activity for overhead, indirect costs. So that predetermined rate, and the word predetermined means it's done ahead of time, so it's based on estimates. You get your estimated total indirect costs for the period of time, usually a month or a year. So how much are these indirect costs going to cost us for the year, let's say? And then you estimate how many units of activity for that cost driver you selected for the whole year. So let's say direct labor hours is your cost driver. So you're just going to spread out your overhead based on direct labor hours. You estimate that, that's the denominator. Okay, so again, these four indirect costs, so manufacturing overhead primarily. You take your estimated indirect cost divided by your estimated activity level. And we'll have an example in a second. Here, so this company manufactures two different products, regular model and deluxe model. So there's overhead that we're trying to figure out how to assign to each of these products. In other words, how much overhead, so in this case, the total overhead for the year is 2 million. So how much of the 2 million should we charge to the deluxe model? How much should we charge to the regular model? An easy way would have been, I'll just give half and half. Okay, so half of this to the deluxe and we'll charge the other half to regular. Okay, that's the easy way. However, that's not the most accurate or comprehensive way to do it. Okay, so it says first, let's determine the unit cost for each of the models using traditional costing. So traditional costing was using one driver for the entire company. And we saw this earlier when we looked at allocating overhead. Okay, so And again, we'll get back to some of these things in a second, okay? So in traditional costing, let's say we decide to use, I don't know if it tells us that, but it doesn't tell us that, but let's assume that, oh here, overhead is assigned on the basis of direct labor hours. So that means direct labor hours are the method or the way we're going to spread out the overhead. So here's the direct labor hours here, the time. Okay, so deluxe models used 1.6 hours per unit. Regular models take 0.8 hours per unit. So you can see the deluxe model uses twice as much labor time as regular models do. So what you have to do is you take that number of units, and again, let me go back here, expected volume. So we're going to make 5,000 deluxe models. We're estimating we're going to make 40,000 regular models. So the first step is to then take the 5,000 units of the deluxe model that we're going to make, multiply it by that 1.6 hours of direct labor for each unit. So there'll be a total of 8,000 direct labor hours used to make the deluxe model, 32,000 hours to make the regular models, total direct labor hours of 40,000 hours. So we simply then take the $2 million overhead in total, divide by this 40,000 total direct labor hours, and we get an overhead rate of $50 per hour. That should actually say predetermined overhead rate, since we're doing this based on estimates. So that's the rate, $50 per each direct labor hour. So if a job or a model takes 10 hours, then we multiply 10 times the 50 per hour. So we're going to charge an extra $500 to cover the overhead, in addition to the direct materials and direct labor, again, which those two can be traced directly to the model, to the products. Okay. So direct material, again, the three costs to manufacture a product are your direct materials, direct labor, and then your manufacturing overhead. Direct materials, we can trace and assign the actual cost of materials to each of the products. Direct labor, we saw earlier, 16 and 8. Here, direct labor costs 16 and 8. There's the direct materials, 150 and 112. Okay, so direct materials, direct materials and direct labor can be directly tied to each of the two models. Then we have to add manufacturing overhead, and this is where we get the $50 an hour that we calculated earlier here, times 1.6 hours it takes to make each deluxe model. It takes 0.8 hours to make each regular model, so you multiply those by that 50 we came up with to get the total cost per unit for the deluxe model and for the regular model. Okay, again, that's the traditional costing method. And again, we can trace the direct materials directly to each of the products. We can trace the direct labor directly to each of the product, but we have to allocate or spread out the manufacturing overhead. We calculated it as $50 per each hour of direct labor used to get the allocation for each product of the overhead per unit to get the total unit cost. Okay, notice, to go back, that we have one predetermined overhead rate, this 50 bucks an hour. We use that for the whole process, for everything. Okay, and again, this traditional costing or job costing, okay, we use just a single predetermined overhead rate. On the other hand, this company is going to use activity-based costing instead. So rather than having a single predetermined overhead rate for the entire process, they're going to use activity-based costing. So they're going to have to break out what they do into different activities or steps in the process. Okay, so they're going to split up or divide up all of their overhead costs into these 4 activities. Purchasing, so buying materials is one activity. Scrap rework. So whenever they have to scrap something and redo it, that's scrap rework. Testing the product, and then machine related activities. Okay, and again, what the activities are is dependent on what management decides or how they decide to break up what they do. And again, this is all of the overhead costs. Whoops, I'm trying to find my cursor there. So these are all the overhead type costs. So remember in the previous example, that $2 million, we just divided that whole thing as is. For activity-based costing, you split up your overhead into different activities and you use different bases or different cost drivers to spread out the overhead. Okay, so we know the overhead costs for each activity here. Okay, and this is how we got the total of $2 million in the previous traditional costing example. This, and let's go back. These are the cost drivers or the way that we're spreading out the overhead, and they're related to the activity. So makes sense for purchasing. You divide the cost of purchasing up into how many orders the purchasing department places. So testing, for example, makes sense that you spread out that cost by the number of tests that you do. Okay, so here are, for each of the 2 products, here's the units of the cost driver for each. So for this means there's 400 orders for the deluxe, 800 orders for the regular. For scrap rework, there must have been 300 scrapping reworks, 300 orders of those, 600 orders of the regular. Yeah. So these are the quantities or number of units of these drivers. Okay, and we'll see how they tie into the allocation in a second. Okay, so again, to remember these numbers here. Okay, so the next thing you do is you get a total of for the 2 different products. So remember on the previous page here, there were 400 purchases, 800 purchases for regular. So 400 for deluxe, 800 for regular. Next step is to get a total of those 2. So this is the total cost driver, deluxe 400 again, regular 800, total of 1200. Okay, so just getting total for the driver units. So here was our activities. Here was the dollar amount for each of those activities, as we saw earlier. So next step is then just to divide the dollar amount of each activity by the total units, cost driver units of each activity. And again, these units, first 2 are orders. Third one is tests, so 15,000 tests, 50,000 hours. Okay, so you're getting a cost per driver for each of the different activities. Remember before we just had one $50 per hour. Here we're dividing it up and we're being more precise by using different drivers for the different activities. Okay, so again, just take the total dollar amount for each activity, divide by the total cost driver units for each activity to get a rate per cost driver unit. Here's those rates per cost driver unit that we just calculated. And then what we do is multiply each of these rates for that activity times the number of units of that activity, of the cost driver for the activity for each of the two models. Okay, and you've seen these cost driver units before here. Okay, so we get $70 for each purchase order. Deluxe model used 400 orders, total allocated of 28,000. Regular models had 800 orders at $70 an order, so that's 56,000. You do that for each of these activities, and you get the cost of the overhead assigned to each of the two products. So you can see the deluxe model is going to get $720,000 of the overhead. The regular model is going to get $1,280 of the overhead. And notice that those two together total that $2 million total that we were trying to spread out. Okay. So this activity-based costing again is how to spread out overhead costs among products using different activities with different cost drivers. Okay. Again, it's more complicated than the traditional method where we just took one driver for the whole company and just use that. More complicated, but it's more accurate, okay, because you're looking at each specific activity in the overhead pool. So, and each of these activities has their own driver. So you have your own predetermined rate for each of the activities rather than just the one that we had in the traditional. Okay, so again, ABC costing is more complicated, but it's more accurate than the traditional method, more precise. Okay, so now that we've figured out the total cost for each of the two products, we can then divide the total cost by the number of units of each of those products that were made, and we have our cost of overhead per unit. So now we add up our direct materials. Again, these are assigned directly to the models. Direct labor, these also are assigned directly to each of the models because we know exactly how much of the materials and how much labor goes into each material. And again, the manufacturing overhead, the allocation of those overhead costs per unit, we calculated up here, add that to each of the models to get our total unit cost. Okay, so the direct materials and direct labor are the same under traditional costing or ABC costing because those are directly traceable to each product. We don't have to do any allocations. However, it's the manufacturing overhead that differs because of the difference in the way that we are allocating or charging each of the two different products. Okay, so now we see that it costs us $3.10 for the deluxe model, $152 for the regular model. And again, that helps us determine what the price is going to be that we charge our customers. Okay, that's the ABC costing. So here is that 310 and 152 we just calculated. Remember earlier, the example for traditional costing, we had 246 and 160. So again, it's just a different way of costing or looking at the cost of a product. But because activity-based costing is more precise as far as allocating overhead, we can see that the deluxe model got charged more than the regular model as compared to when we did the traditional. And it's because these specialized, like the deluxe model has less volume, they sold less units, but it cost them more for the overhead. So it cost, the calculation of the cost was higher, under activity-based costing. Again, because it's more precise. Yeah. Okay, so benefits of activity-based costing: better cost information, so it's more precise. So the managers can make better pricing decisions that way. Okay. Let's see. You can read this yourself. It's fairly self-explanatory. Obviously, as companies become more automated, overhead cost becomes a larger portion of the product cost because there's less direct labor and more overhead in the form of machines. Yep. So ABC becomes even more important or more precise than the traditional costing used to be. And I guess that's the chapter. Okay. So that's chapter 4. Chapter 5 will follow shortly. Okay. Aloha.